All right, guys. So this week we're talking about savings and investment in a closed economy. It's a little bit more theoretical than some of the other chapters in the sense that when we start building up on different topics, we want to keep things simple at first. So here we're assuming a closed economy. Closed economy means no trade with other countries. So if you think about that, it's limitative at first. So it kind of creates a little bit of limit. So if I think about like real world applications of this chapter, there's less than usual just because it's a little bit limited. However, it's important to understand this simpler version before we move on. And one thing to note here, when we say no trade, there's a difference between no trade and no net exports. Or, rather, there's a difference between this difference with nx is equal to 0. Nx is equal to 0, net exports is equal to 0, implies that exports and imports are equal to one another. But they don't necessarily have to be both equal to 0. Okay, it implies this. But no trade, closed economy implies that exports is equal to 0 and imports is equal to 0. So it's not the same thing. Because if we think of Canada in general, especially with the States, we're close enough. We're not at a situation where net exports is equal to 0, which would mean that we export and import the same value. But we're close enough. We're not like really big exporters versus importers. There's not a big difference between the two. So it is hovering around 0. And that can happen in an open economy, open being the opposite of a closed economy. However, when we're talking about this closed economy framework, we disregard completely of net exports. So when we think of this closed economy framework, we say that GDP, like this Y, could be, you could say GDP, you could call it national income. Some textbooks just call it income on its own, is equal to C plus I plus G. The NX part, the exports and imports part, doesn't exist here. So when I think about this chapter, I'm not saying start forgetting about net exports. The goal behind it is just to try to start learning some associations in a simpler context. It's not to say that this isn't important. It's just trying to keep it simple as best as possible. Okay? So what is built in this chapter here? We build a relationship between savings and investment. So a first kind of relationship could be built using this kind of identity here. And we could say, I call this income. Well, I could say that my income minus C, if I bring my C over to the other side, minus G, if I bring G to the other side, is equal to my investment. Why Y minus C minus G? Well, Y represents my income, C represents consumer spending, and G represents government spending. So if I aggregate all of income and I remove the spending portions, well, what I remained with at the end is national saving. Is equal to investment. So far, that was just a bit of mathematical gymnastics being done, switching things around and calling it a bit differently. And it's just a math part, the kind of like baseline to it, the kind of proof to what I'm about to say. But then if you just think about it simply in practice, it all makes sense. And it's that practical side of things I want you guys to kind of understand here at this point. So if I assume that all of Canada is right in this room right now, like we're the only people of this country, and there's no one else, like this is a closed environment, we don't trade with anyone else, so we have different people here, we have a blacksmith, we have a farmer, we have different trades working here. And I asked myself, well, how much money is available to be borrowed? So I could say, well, the amount of money that's available to be borrowed for investment purposes is how much is being saved. Okay? We could think about it as money-wise, but we could also think about it like product-wise. If we go way back when into the old times, well, let's say I'm a farmer and I create a certain amount of tomatoes, a certain amount of animal product, a certain amount of food products, and I consume a portion of that. There's a remainder that is left. And what I don't consume, what I save, whether it's monetary or whether it's product-wise, is what is available for others to borrow. If someone else is here and says, I need a pig, or I need a few tomatoes, if I didn't consume all my tomatoes, there is some available for this person to borrow. I won't give it to him, I'll lend it to him. And I could lend it to him and say, I'll give you a pig now, even though I'd like to have it, but in a certain amount of time, you're going to give me back a pig plus interest. So you'll give me back a pig plus a chicken, or something else. Okay? But if I think about it money-wise, you need $1,000 now to buy something. I could lend you that money, and I'll lend you that money probably with a certain interest expectation. But at the end of the day, the total amount of money that is available for borrowing is equal to the total amount of money that is being saved at a given point in time. So if I think about this equilibrium between demand for investment and savings supply, well, at this equilibrium, we have a situation where savings is equal to investment. What is being lent is equal to what is being borrowed. So regardless of how you see it, just think about it and the words you want to use. Total amount lent equals total borrowed. It doesn't mean that if you're starting up a business that you need to borrow money. You might have accumulated that money over time. You may have accumulated what is required to operate this business, to operate this farm, to operate whatever that you're thinking of doing. But the amount of money that people borrow, let's say all of society is in this classroom here, the total amount of money that people are borrowing, someone is on the other end of it and is loaning that money. It has to be the case. It doesn't make sense if it isn't the case. Okay? So regardless of how you see it, there's always two people, like there's two sides to this transaction. The simplest way of seeing it is, if I need to borrow $5,000, I might walk around the classroom and see who here has some money that they could loan me. And probably I'll have to ask a bunch of you to end up getting at $5,000. And I'll promise you guys to pay you back with interest. Okay? That is like borrower to lender direct relationship. But there's other ways that businesses get access to money. Does anyone know those ways? From
banks?
Yeah, they can borrow from banks. So banks is kind of an intermediary. You put money into the banks, and the banks keeps only a portion of that money as reserves and loans out the rest. We'll talk more about that with the chapter of money. And that money goes to the borrower. So there's this intermediary, but it's essentially they're lending the money that one of us deposited in the bank. Yeah?
Money in exchange of future profit?
Money in exchange for future profit. So you're talking about like part ownership of a company. So stocks. Yeah. Stocks. Yeah. Okay. Someone else here? Stocks. Okay. Yeah.
Payday loans.
Payday loans? What do you mean by payday loans?
Like I see businesses and there's like you get a loan on your payday, $1,000, whatever.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, so businesses could give you loans as well, I guess. That's a form of transfer between borrower and saver, direct transfer. And there's also bonds. So bonds is one that kind of comes up because it helps us understand throughout the chapters that we're going to see the relationship. If we have a situation of excess supply, excess demand of money, we'll kind of understand how it brings us back to equilibrium. But in a nutshell, a bond is a pretty simple instrument. It's an instrument that you're essentially loaning money to a business, or it could be a government institution, by buying their bond. So if you buy it at issuance, you give them a certain amount of money. In exchange, essentially what they're giving you is an IOU document, which is saying at a certain date, maturity date, everything's very precise on a bond. So maybe in exactly 1 year's time or in exactly 10 years' time, this document, you will be able to exchange it for $1,000. Okay? And depending on how risky this business is and how much interest you want to get from this business to loan them money, well, the amount of money you'll pay now to get $1,000 in the future will be lower if you expect this business to be very risky. If you pay $500 for it now and in a year's time you get $1,000, well, that's like 100% interest. For you to get 100% interest, it has to be a really risky company because no one pays that amount of interest. But if you buy from a very safe government institution, you might be paying like, I don't know, $970 to getting $1,000 a year's time. So you're getting like 3%-ish. And that's more standard. Yeah, in the back, first question. Yeah.
Is inflation factored into bonds?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So when we think about inflation, the important concept to keep in mind always is the real interest rate. And that's always going to be your nominal rate, so what you see. And I mean nominal interest rate minus inflation. So if I expect inflation to be 2% in the coming year, and you ask me to loan you $1,000, if I only charge you 2% nominal interest rate, well, in real terms, I'm getting nothing out of it. What I mean by I'm getting nothing out of it, well, this year I could buy $1,000 worth of products. If I loan you the money, in a year's time you give me $1,020, but because of this inflation, all of those products now cost $1,020. So I didn't get more purchasing power. The real interest rate tells you how your purchasing power changes over time. If you have a positive interest rate, if you invest in that, if you put money aside, you loan money at that rate, you get more purchasing power over time. And if it's negative, you get less purchasing power over time. So if you negotiate 2% interest and in the end there's 3% inflation, well, that gives you a real interest rate of -1, which would mean that you're losing purchasing power. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because if I give you $1,000, you give me back $1,020, but the products that are selling $1,000 now sell for $1,030 next year, I no longer can afford them. So I've lost out on my purchasing power in that year's time. So any form of interest rate that you see accounts for inflation to some extent. To answer your question, it does. But you're not protected from inflation. So if I buy a bond now and I pay $960 and I expect to get $1,000 in a year's time, get more or less 4% on this financial instrument. Well, if during this year Canada has just printed money like crazy and we end up having like 15 or 20% interest, I will still only get $1,000 in a year's time. I will still get an implied interest rate of 4%. So in that case, I'm losing purchasing power over this year's time. So most bonds are not protected by inflation. Some can be, but most bonds are not. And that's why, it gives another reason why we like to keep inflation rates steady, close enough to that 2% target, because otherwise it makes it really hard to know, should I lend money or should I not? What will inflation rates be over the next year? Is it worthwhile? Will I gain purchasing power or lose? Whereas if it's always 2% steady, you know that if you get like more than 2%, you're gaining some level of purchasing power over that period of time. Or at least not losing as much as if you did nothing with that money. Yeah?
In the book it says that if a government issued bond, like the federal government, it's 1.76%. So it means that each year you're like losing money, you're losing purchasing power.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't have to be 1.76%. That's maybe an example that they give in the book. That interest rate changes. But typically, if you were to go to any banking institution and you said, I want a government bond or a treasury bill or something super safe. By super safe, mostly what we're talking about is default risk. Default risk is the risk of this company going bankrupt. Well, the government of Canada not paying their obligations after a year's time is very small. The Trump organization or another business not paying their bills after a certain time is a different story. So that kind of situation that you have there, if the safety is there, very low default risk, you'll often see interest rates that are really low. So you might put money aside and you'll only get like 1%. Or like I've had some just before building my house this summer, I had some money aside and the rates were really low what I was getting, but it was such a short time horizon that I didn't want to risk it by investing in stocks and having it crash in that short-term horizon. On a long-term horizon, it makes sense to buy stocks. So I didn't, and I knew I wasn't getting inflation. Like I wasn't getting in much, but getting 0.8% or 1.2 or 1.8 was better than getting 0 and still suffering that inflation. So it's still better, but you're not gaining purchasing power. If you're thinking, oh, I'm going to be able to retire and have more and more things, if you get less than inflation, you're not. That's not true. Yeah.
Is that why the government guarantees a certain amount of savings with bank institutions? Like for example, if like I have a certain amount of money in my RBC account, and if RBC goes under, the government will guarantee that money.
That's a totally different reason, but that's an interesting topic that we're going to talk about in the future. I'll talk about it right now because you asked the question. But that idea of insuring, and I'm forgetting it from the top of my head. I believe it's around $150,000. Your first $150,000, your bank account is insured by the CDIC, the Canada Deposit Insurance Corporation in Quebec. For Desjardins, c'est l'Autorité des marchés financiers that insures it for the co-op of Desjardins. The reason behind that $150,000 being insured is to make sure that if the banking system is being like on the rocks, like 2008 style when we had that last financial crisis, well, if you're in that situation, the last thing you want to happen is for everyone to get their money out of the banking system at the same time because they fear that that bank's going to go bankrupt. And we'll talk about why run on the banks that are commonly known are very detrimental to an economy, because as soon as everyone pulls their money out, like it just dries up all of the amount of money that's available for investing, and it dries up a lot of things, and a lot of things start crashing. So the government wants to avoid us running at the bank every time we think that they might go bankrupt. The bank itself. We're not talking about other institutions, but the bank itself. So by insuring up to 150,000, which I believe is the amount, you're making sure that most people don't have 150,000 in their checking account. So most people will just leave their money there if they know that if the bank fails, the government will pay whatever you had in that bank account.
But doesn't that also relate to like the discussion around bonds and stocks? Because if I know if I'm going to invest in RBC, the chances that the Canadian government will let RBC go under is very minimal. Doesn't that help with like me investing? Because like we saw like things got bailed out.
Yeah. Okay. So once again we're talking about two different things, but still very interesting. Now you're comparing the concept of too big to fail and just investing in just having money in your checking account. So if I buy bonds or stocks or whatever from a bank, you are right to think that some banks or some companies may be seen as too big to fail by the government, so that if ever they're about to go bankrupt, they're likely going to be bailed out. Likely. Not assuredly, but likely. Which means that some businesses might be protected from this. And you could think about other businesses as well. Like a few years back, Bombardier would have kind of semi-fit that category. Even though they're not the banking system, it's a company that employs a lot of people. So if you feel that they're about to go bankrupt, there's a good chance that the government might step in and stop them from going bankrupt. It doesn't mean that the value of the stock, the value of the company that you have will not go down if they're on the brink of bankruptcy and then they have to receive a bailout. So it doesn't mean it's an assured good investment. But there's a big difference between buying stocks or bonds of RBC or CIBC or any of the banks, which you could see as a safe enough investment in terms of savings. Once again, like not to confuse the word investment and buying equipment and everything else and the savings that you have. So it could be a safe way to save your money, to put your money aside, versus the amount of money that you leave in your checking account is protected if the bank fails. Like one of them is to make sure that if the bank is about to fail, that not everyone who has like just a simple checking account at that bank takes their money out. And the other one is true that some banks, if they're about to fail, they might get bailed out. But they didn't all get bailed out. Like some really large banks, which could have been coined as too big to fail, failed in 2008. So it's still possible, but I agree with you that sometimes they get bailed out. But one of them is based on someone's loans, and one of them is based on you buying stocks of this company. Yeah? Does that clear it up, or?
No, I think I was like.
Yeah, go for it. Like that's fine.
Right?
Huh?
I was assuming that like since the government has a certain level, since there's a certain level of trust that some banks are too big to fail, that it might encourage more investment.
Yeah, of course.
And it might affect the chart based on government policy to
Yeah.
whether or not to increase the ceiling on how much savings is protected, or even which banks are considered too big to fail. That was one of the questions.
Yeah, for sure. You're creating a greater quantity. There's more savings if you don't think that you're going to lose all your money, and these banks might have access to lower interest rates, which will lead to more investment as well. So yes, you're right. That's true. Yeah. That consolidates. That puts them together. Yeah, for sure. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do we have to pay tax for bond, or when we gain something for bond?
Yeah, so that's a good question to ask. Taxes, how do taxes work? We'll just kind of cover that very briefly, even though it's not really part of this chapter. So, generally speaking, when you have a bond and you earn, let's say, $100, that could be seen as interest income. And that interest income is typically taxed unless you have it in a tax shelter. The two main tax shelters that we have in our economy are tax-free savings account, in English, CELI in French, compte épargne libre d'impôt, and RRSPs, or REER in French, registered retirement savings plans. Régime d'épargne retraite, something like that. So these two are ways to shelter any interest income, capital gains, or whatever you might have over a certain period of time. They both can offer the same advantage. Each of them have kind of a clear advantage over the other on certain aspects. But both of them shelter off some of that interest income. Okay? So whether it's interest income or capital gains that you make from a stock purchase, and if it's within a tax-free savings account or RRSPs, that is sheltered. So how does a tax-free savings account work and how does an RRSP work? I'll just go like blanket kind of explanation here. I won't go into the number details, but tax-free savings account, essentially you have a total amount max that you could invest, and that amount goes up every year that you are above 18 years old. So your maximum allowance on a tax-free savings account is not the same as mine, because I've been over 18 since they introduced the tax-free savings account. It was around the time I was a student here that they introduced the tax-free savings account. And roughly the tax-free savings account per year was like somewhere between $5,500 and like $8,000 or $9,000 that you're allowed to contribute. I think total now I can contribute around $62,000-ish or something. But let's say you just turned 18 and this year's limit is $6,000. I'm not sure exactly what this year's limit is. Well, that would mean that you would be able to buy $6,000 worth of savings instruments, whether stocks, bonds, or whatever, and say that that amount of money, that purchase there, I want to shelter any gains I have from it from being taxed, from an income tax perspective. But this amount of money that you put into a tax-free savings account is your own money. So this is after-tax savings, and the interests are tax-free. Okay. Whereas an RRSP, when you buy a savings instrument, whether it's a stock, bond, or mutual fund, whatever it may be, and you say, this is contribution to my RRSP in 2020, well, this amount of money leads to an income tax deduction. And then you are taxed when you take the money out. Okay. Yeah.
With the education, I think RESP, would that follow the same rules as the RRSP, like the education savings plans? Or is it more like a TFSA?
I'd have to look into it. I've never looked into the RESP actually. So do you know how it works? If you just tell me the procedure, is it that you put money aside and then that money you could use for education purposes in the future without having to pay taxes on the interest earned?
It depends. Normally it's like you would put money in for education purposes.
Yeah.
And I assume there'd be some interest in, and then you can, depending on what type of plan you have, you can take it out, take money for education purposes only.
Yeah.
Normally once or twice a year, and then until it runs out.
Okay.
It has to be for education purposes. So
Yeah.
you only have to claim it.
I'd have to look into it, to be honest. And if anyone wants to just kind of quickly glance through your phone or computer and take a look and tell me more what the steps are to contributing, I'd be able to tell you which one it's more like. But otherwise, it's going to be similar to one of these, I'm expecting. So one of them is like, let's say this year I earn $100,000. And at the end of the year, I pay my income taxes like $35,000, $40,000, $50,000, whatever it may be. And out of the remaining amount of money that I have that is mine after I've paid income taxes, well, I've consumed, I've bought my food, I've bought everything that I own. And at the end of the year, the amount of money I have left, let's say I have 10K left, and I decide to put that money in a tax-free savings account, I've already paid income taxes on that money earned. So that is already done. So when I put money aside, I don't get an extra tax advantage with the tax-free savings account. But when I do so, afterwards, when I earn interest, I don't pay taxes on those the interest that I earn. Whereas on RRSP, it could be a situation that this year I decide to put $20,000 aside, and out of that $20,000 aside, let's say my marginal tax rate is 50%, I get $10,000 back right away because of income tax returns. Because let's say I was like even Steven with the government in terms of income taxes, that I didn't owe them anything, they didn't owe me anything, and I decided to contribute $20,000. Well, it means that that amount of money I shouldn't have paid income tax on, and my marginal tax rate, let's say it's 50%. Well, they're going to give me back $10,000. Okay. But the day that I go to take that $20,000 back out of the RRSP, they're going to tax it completely. So all of a sudden, that 20 or 21,000, if I get 50% taken away, well, out of 21,000, I only have 10,500 left. So I only get a bit more. Okay. As much as I did a mathematical equivalency here, these two are mathematically equivalent. If you were to calculate it out, I won't ask you guys to calculate it out, but if you want to know, like I'll just kind of tell you the key points here. These two are mathematically equivalent. What I mean by mathematically equivalent is if you put 10,000 aside and you call it an RSP or a tax-free savings account, assuming that you have enough leeway that you can put whatever amount of money aside in either category, because an RRSP is based on your yearly earnings, and your maximal contribution kind of adjusts year after year depending on if you contributed or not. And this is based on your age and what were the contributions those years possible, and you accumulate it. Well, if you put 10,000 aside in either one, you'll get the exact same thing, mathematically equivalent, if over savings time, your marginal income tax rate does not change. Yeah. At some point, I wanted to make a video about this, and it's not something you need to know for this class. But if I do end up making one in the following weeks, I'll post it for you guys, because a lot of people ask me this question over the years, just because I'm a reference in different things relating to finance and economics. But they're both the same if your interest rate, your marginal income tax rate doesn't change. So your marginal income tax rate is like, if I earn $100,000, if I were to earn an extra dollar or an extra $1,000, what percentage of that extra $1,000 or $1 would I owe to the government? And if it's 50% total, like Quebec and federal, that's my marginal tax rate. But in Canada, we have what we call a progressive tax system. Progressive tax system, if we were to look at the tax charts, you would see that if you earn $30,000, $40,000, your marginal tax rate is much lower than if you earn $100,000 or $200,000 or $300,000. When you earn more, every extra dollar that you earn is getting taxed at a higher rate. There's different kind of brackets, and in microeconomics, I go over, and it's a typical exam question in the final, to ask about income tax rate calculations. But essentially, you cannot earn more money and end up with less money after you've paid your taxes. That's impossible. But the more you earn, the more that extra $1,000 is going to cost you in terms of income taxes. So if I were to if you were to send me a check for $1,000 that has to be declared by the government, I would rather it send you the money, and then after taxes are paid, we kind of redistribute it somehow, because you're not going to lose a lot of that $1,000, where I'll lose about half. If you send me a contract and you pay me $1,000, I'll lose about half of that. because at the amount of money I earn, an extra 1,000, I lose about 50% of it. Why is this relevant? Well, this is relevant because the idea behind a registered retirement savings plan is you're gaining income tax deductions now, and when you get the money out, you're paying income taxes. And the purpose behind this instrument here is that, let's say right now I'm earning $100,000 and I'm losing half of my money to the government, or half of the extra dollars to the government, not the whole amount. If I were to put $10,000 aside, I'd get $5,000 back, which is really interesting. And if I keep this amount of money till my retirement, and at my retirement I have no income because I'm no longer working, and I decide to retrieve only that $10,000 because I farm my own products and everything, I don't need that much money, so I'm just pulling out $10,000. Well, if I pull out $10,000, I'll get pretty much zero income taxes to owe on that amount. So if you go from a situation where you have high income tax period to a low income tax period, RRSP is the best choice. Because you're taking income tax advantages now, and you'll owe income taxes later, but because you're not earning much money, you won't owe that much. However, buying an RRSP to take it out in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, when you're going to be making more money, is a stupid decision. It's like a terrible decision. You shouldn't do it. Don't even think about it. Tax-free savings account is the way to go. If you're going to put money aside to buy a car or to buy a house in 5-10 years, don't RRSP. Unless RRSP, the only thing that could be good to the RRSP, and I did it this past year, is if you're going to buy your first house, there's a program that kind of exists where you can take a portion of that money out, and as long as you pay it back within 10 years, you don't lose any money, you're just kind of like deferring. Anyways, except for that specific situation, if you're going to buy a car or something else in the future, get a tax-free savings account, because in that case, the amount of money that you put aside, even though your income tax rate goes up, all the interest rate that you earn afterwards is fully tax-free. So you're going to gain. But in the RRSP example, imagine that you put $10,000 aside now. And because you're students, you're paying pretty much nothing in income taxes. So you save like $500 from putting that $10,000 aside. And in 10 years' time, you earn $100K or $200,000, whatever. And you take that money out. Well, even though it's gone up from $10,000 to $15,000, let's say, if you owe half of that money to the government, you invested $10,000, 10 years down the line, you get $7,500 back. It doesn't make any sense. So if you go from a situation of low income tax rates, marginal income tax rates, to high income tax rates because your income is going up, so that's another way to see it. If your income is going up, tax-free savings account is the best thing. This is between putting your money aside and taking it out. And if your income is going down, which is typically the case when you retire, well, then your RRSP is a better choice. And if your income tax never changes over 10 years' time, they're mathematically equivalent, completely equivalent. If you run the math and you put $10,000 aside or whatever the amount to make them equivalent from the start, how much money you put aside and how much money you have left for your consumption purposes, and you take it out 10, 20, 30 years later, if you have the same tax rate, they're exactly the same result. Nothing is different. No advantage to one or the other. But if your income is going up, this one's superior. If your income is going down in that time period, this one's superior. Okay. Kind of veered off track, but I think it's good to know, as sooner or later you'll be putting money aside, and they're definitely really good instruments to have, because if you're going to put money aside in whatever instrument that you have, if you have access to this allocation and you're not using it, you're losing out on interest that you can earn tax-free. I didn't have that advantage when I was younger than you guys, when I put in money aside when I was 16, 17 and working a lot. But these days I have. These days you guys have as well. Any other questions? All right, so to kind of, I don't want to go too long in this class here because it's not the most applied one, so I'll give you guys a smaller day, I guess. But coming back to the demand for investment and the savings supply, okay? The equilibrium between the two is going to lead to an equilibrium interest rate. And different factors can shift the savings curve or the demand curve. And in those situations, you have to always ask yourself the same thing that we do for just same old supply and demand in microeconomics or any other graph, is you always have to ask yourself, if the interest rate were to stay the same, is there an incentive or is there a reason for this curve to move? Because if this is changing, and there was a small typo in one of the quiz questions, but if this is changing, you're only supposed to be moving along these curves. But what can shift my savings supply if I just focus on this one here? Well, what are the factors that could say that if the interest rates were to stay the same, why would all of a sudden there would be more savings available? Okay, so I'll start with a non-obvious one, which kind of relates to something that was discussed earlier today, which relates on the topic that savings is not just private saving, it's private and public saving. So if I think that at this interest rate, this is the amount of money available to be borrowed, well, if all of a sudden the government has a big budget surplus, it was expected to be a balanced budget or a balanced deficit, and all of a sudden it has a big surplus, well, because there's this increase in public saving, we're going to have more money available at the same interest rate. Okay? You could also think about other factors that means that the savings curve will move. Like I mentioned, we talked a lot about tax-free savings account, but well, tax-free savings account, when they were introduced, it meant that more people had an incentive to save even though interest rates didn't stay the same. Because when you earn 5% interest, and after you've earned it, you need to pay back some of the money to the government because you've earned interest income and you earn a good salary, that 5% can quickly become like a 3% after taxes. And then you take away inflation, then you only have like 1%. So is it really worthwhile for you to lend money? It all depends. But if all of a sudden the government introduces an instrument, tax-free savings account, that if you use, you now keep 5% of that interest instead of 3% after tax. And now you remove the inflation, 2%, you still have 3%. It's much more worthwhile to save that money and to bring it to the financial markets. So the introduction of a TFSA did that. It increased the supply curve. So introduction of TFSA, or if you increase the contributions allowed, it would do this. If you increase the contributions on RSP, would shift the savings curve right. An increase in public saving would shift the savings curve right. All of those things would shift the savings curve right. If I were to add the demand curve here, the demand for investment, well, if there's more savings available, what I expect to happen is over time, this would lead to initially an excess saving of money. There's a lot of money going around, and eventually it's going to put a downward pressure on interest rates. That's what we expect. But the first question, the first story you have to relate to is, why is this curve moving? And if I just look on the curve on itself and I fix the interest rate, I should ask myself, is there a reason for this to move? If there's an investment tax credit and I'm a saver, there's no advantage to me. If whoever's borrowing money gets a tax credit, or there's more deductions, like for electric cars, you could fully amortize the electric car within the first year, 100% amortization, it's a fiscal advantage. Well, if I'm not the investor and I'm just a saver who has an extra amount of money to loan to anyone around, well, that doesn't influence me. It's going to influence the investor, the person who's borrowing the money, but it's not going to influence the saver. So here, if I think about my demand for investment, well, for a certain interest rate, if all of a sudden this is the interest rate you have to pay to buy your new electric car, but all of a sudden you have tax advantages if you do buy that electric car that make it interesting, well, for the same interest rate, there's going to be more people that will be tempted to borrow, so the investment curve would shift right. So an increase in tax credits would do that. Another advantage is that lead to, for the same interest rate, a higher level of money demanded for investment purposes. So every time you have curves, if something that is on the graph changes, it's only going to create movements along the curve. But if it's something else that has a reason for a certain interest rate or a certain one of this fixed to change the other one, then it's going to lead to a situation where the curve moves and it's going to have an impact on the end equilibrium. But an increase in tax credits does not change savings as much as an increase in tax-free savings account does not change things from an investor's perspective. I used to be a saver, and then I started building a house, and now I am a borrower. So the things that relate to savers, even if they triple the amount of contributions I could do this year, I have no money to put aside. All my money's in my house. And when I go back to being a saver, it's going to change me. It's going to change how I behave. So if it's something that influences one, it doesn't necessarily influence the other. The only way that it influences the other is, once again, if I add the other curve there, the investment tax credit I know hasn't changed the savings supply, but as more investors are borrowing money, it's creating an excess demand for money, which creates an upward pressure on the interest rate. And it means that whoever's loaning them money, the savers, they're getting a higher interest rate. So it's this relationship between the two that determines interest rates. At the end of the day, if we have a classroom full of people and only one person wants to borrow money and everyone else has an excess amount of money, probably this person will be able to negotiate a really low rate, because maybe someone at first will tell them 2-3% to loan you $1,000 for a year time. And then someone else will go like, well, I got like a few thousand laying around doing nothing. I'll even give it to you for like 1.5. And then someone else maybe even lower. Because there's an abundance of money being saved. There's very few people that want it. But if it was the opposite, there's a lot of people running after money and just a few of us here that have money to be lent, well, then we could charge much higher interest rates. Because I know that if he refuses my 10% offer, someone else here will accept it. I could charge a much higher interest rate. So that is based on all of these flows of savings curves and investment curves. This is just a theoretical, abstract way of seeing it, but that's what's happening in practice. Yeah?
So yeah, you're in that counterexample. So I just didn't hear. So is supply? Did you flip it? Did you say supply was low and it was higher? Or did you just say supply was high, but then the demand increases?
In this example here, or?
In the one you just said. So like the class.
So in the class example, if I have a low amount of savings available, low amount of savings supply, and a bunch of people who want to borrow that money, we're going to have a situation where it's going to have a high interest rate, because if I have money to lend and one or two other people here, but everyone else is needing to borrow money to be able to feed themselves and everything else, well, you can be sure that they'll pay a higher interest rate. So if there's few savers and a bunch of lenders, you'll have a bunch of borrowers, you'll have really high interest rates. If the amount of savers goes down, interest rates go up. If the amount of people who want to borrow money goes up, interest rates goes up as well. And the opposite is that they both go down as well. But as soon as there's less people here available to borrow from, higher interest rate, more people want money, higher interest rate. Yeah. Any other questions? No? So just make sure that you understand the different things that lead to shifts of these curves and the impact that it has on the overall equilibrium, and the fact that in a closed economy we have savings, total savings, national, which is public and private, is equal to investment. Soon we're going to introduce other countries, we're going to introduce net exports, and then we're going to have a second identity, which will be savings and net capital outflow leads to an equilibrium with net exports. We'll talk about that soon, but this was just kind of like the easy baseline to understand if we have this group here, and this is all the money that's available as someone here has it or someone here wants it. It's an easy starting point to understand, but then afterwards we have to keep in mind that in the world it might be that in Canada we have a bunch of borrowers and they're borrowing from other countries, but we're giving them goods, and there's other things at play. There's a lot more at play when we introduce global markets, and it could be dizzying if you start right away with that, and that's why we started with the easier example, the simpler example. Cool? All right, I'll leave you to it for now, and we'll dive into more applied stuff when we get into a more realistic example. Have a good day, guys. I'll see you next Monday.